Hey everyone, thank you so much for checking out this video. I apologize for kind of a clickbait of a headline, but this video is going to be super important if you are a beginner. So let's get right into it. If you're a beginner, I can almost guarantee you that your writing is weak in part because you are using poetic language. I see this all the time, especially people that I coach. I see this a ton. So when I say poetic language, what I'm referring to is language that is not concrete and is not actually factual for your character. Often this is in the form of absolutes. A good example is I can think of a book that someone had self-published on here, and what they did was they wrote a scene about basically them as a child getting superpowers and killing their family. That's like the opening prologue of this book, and the chapter ends with the statement, so-and-so character relived this nightmare every night for like 15 or 16 years. Okay. That's a good example of poetic language. Obviously, this character did not literally have a nightmare of them killing their parents every night for 15 years, right? If they did, they would not be a normal functioning adult, which they are portrayed throughout the story. In the book, they are portrayed as just an average teenager now with superpowers. Okay? That doesn't make any sense. If they were having nightmares every single night of their life, they would be, again, like locked up in an asylum. They'd have, drastically probably self-harmed themselves, potentially tried suicide, etc. If they had such a traumatic dream every single day. So that's a good example right there of poetic language. It's not actually true. If you took a step back, really examined what you wrote and looked at it, you'd realize, no, that's not actually true for my character, nor is it true for any kind of real life scenario. This is what I'm talking about. It's writing and putting things down on the page that are actually not true, but that you don't really think over. The author of that passage, for example, obviously didn't think it over. Like, they didn't actually sit back and think, okay, this person's really going to have nightmares for 16 years. What they thought was, that's a cool line to end a chapter on. That's a cool little hook of a line. And that's basically what this video right now is all about, is trying to avoid that language. Poetic language often, again, is in absolutes, so whenever you write like an expression like such as using the word all or always, those are good red flags to double check and see if your writing is being poetic, because often absolutes are not true. You don't always do X, Y, or Z activity. Just go back through your work and check. You'll find that you don't. Another good example is with time as well. When people have passages of time in stories, maybe there's a shocking revelation and you write, and I've seen this all the time. People will write all the time. That wasn't really a pun. And again, good example right there, poetic language. I don't actually see this all the time. And if I wrote that, that would be very, very weak. So, but I see this a ton, which is people will write something, some sort of scene where maybe there's a revelation or a shocking moment, and they'll say, the characters stared at one another and didn't say a word for 5 minutes, right? Obviously, that's not true. You could get out a timer and time how long 5 minutes actually is in terms of waiting. I mean, this video itself is almost, at this point, almost 5 minutes in. That's not actually true. They didn't actually stare at each other for 5 minutes. If you think back to your most shocking revelation in your life, the most shocking moment of your life where there was a pause, I can guarantee it was nowhere near 5 minutes. But again, it's poetic language. It's how we construct things and how we use language in real life. As I just gave an example myself when I was, saying I always see this, right? We use poetic language in our real lives. In the writing realm, it needs to be factual. It needs to be real and truthful for the character. Yes, there's an area for poetry in writing and to sort of wax poetic, but when you're writing about characters and moments, that's not when you need to employ that tactic. So, what I would suggest instead is trying to avoid any kind of absolute language and trying to avoid any language that comes across as concrete, such as like a passing of time, when it's not factually true. Instead of saying we stared at each other for 5 minutes, you could simply say, moments passed before we said anything, before we spoke. That's better because moments can be kind of any stretch of time, but certainly it's a far smaller increment than the minutes are. And you haven't defined how many moments. Was it one? Was it like 2 moments or 10 moments or 20? No one really knows. So you can kind of get away with that. It is a vagueness to it in that sense. So that's what I'm referring to, is trying to avoid poetic language. Go back through your stories, read them, and actually read, did this literally happen? That's all you have to do. Just ask yourself, did this literally happen for my character? And you're going to find, if you're a beginner, that oftentimes no. That you write things, especially certain absolutes, and you'll realize these don't actually happen. These don't actually occur for either your character or in real life, and you need to remove it. Poetic language makes your writing very, very weak, and it makes the audience unable to take your work seriously. The audience reads for believability. We trust you as the author to tell the story truthfully, or truthfully to your character. Obviously, if you're employing the unreliable narrator or bias and all that stuff that for your character, that's a great storytelling technique. But as the author, when you give things like time increments or absolutes and you write poetically, we aren't going to believe your story, and it's going to take us out of it. All right. So hopefully this didn't take up too much time. And if you're a beginner, I do hope this helped you. I see it a ton. I see this a lot, and so I'm hoping that if you can do this, your prose will improve quite a bit. I think it's one of the first big things, one of the first big steps for writers along their path to really go from like a beginner to more like an intermediate writer, is to start becoming more concrete with their language, start being more literal. And once that happens, everything starts to just improve. So with that, I'm going to sign off here, and I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much for checking out the video.